Hello, this is Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. One of the most debated and controversial topics in religion and philosophy classes has to do with free will. Do we as humans have it or not? And if so, what is it? Our guest, Dr. Tom Ellis, will guide us through a few of the crucial insights that give fresh perspectives on the question of just how free we are anyway. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you for returning. You've been on the program a couple of times, three
have.
times or four, and it's always nice to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me back.
Now, today's topic, you know our students love to talk about free
Everybody loves to talk about free will.
And I guess, you know, it seems self-evident that we have this thing we call free will.
It does.
We make choices every day. We seem to make choices based upon our own conscious decisions.
That's right.
So why is it so controversial? I mean, maybe we could start by defining free will, and that would help us
Right. Well,
to better understand.
Sure. Yes, there's no question about it. From our first-person perspective, our introspection, it appears that we are the conscious authors of our actions and our decisions, and that nothing and no one has caused us to do this. So free will is this thought that we attribute a capacity to ourselves to act autonomously. That when we come across a choice between A and B, I choose A this time, and nothing and no one forced me to choose A. And the real sort of industrial strength free will thinkers will say, and if we were to rewind the tape of time and play everything out again, right up to that moment where I had that choice between A and B, I could have chosen B. That's what we kind of have the notion of free will, that within all these deterministic physical systems that we know exist, there's something here that enables us to either influence these physical systems from a perspective above, or somehow within the physical systems are able to escape those causal laws for just that little bit of time in order to make a decision that could not have been foreseen, could not have been predicted in advance.
So there's some key words going on there. The key word for thinking in free will terms would be autonomy.
Yes.
Right. If you were to want to question free will, you would suggest that there's no such thing as true autonomy, that there are all sorts of external factors working upon us. Biological determinism.
Right.
Psychological determinism.
Right. Yes.
All sorts of external factors that we may not even be aware of.
Well, there you're hitting on something that's fascinating and provoking. This of what we are aware, and the results from neuroscience, neuropsychology, it's pretty robust that there is a plethora of brain activity, a majority of brain activity, of which we are unaware. And it looks like that unconscious brain activity is influencing our decision-making processes, of which we're consciously aware. And so, if consciousness is sort of the agent that we're trying to save here or trying to prop up, then it looks like unconscious processes could be some of those external factors. It's certainly external to conscious awareness, might be part of the same mind-brain system,
right,
but we are not aware of it. What we are aware of looks like a tip of an iceberg.
So this is a more nuanced discussion then. We don't have to refer to God or to biology or to any other sort of external factors other than our own brain. And that there might be ways that our conscious decision-making processes are influenced outside of consciousness.
That's right.
By our own brain.
That's right. So we do want to be sure that the brain is a phenotype. So we get our brains from a combination of our genetics, which we didn't choose, right? And our environmental influences over which we had no choice. So our development, environmental development, and genetic code, these things produce the phenotype, the brain, and it comes locked in place with all the rest of the physical systems. I remember one author once suggested that to have free will, we needed to have something that's not predictable and not random. Unfortunately, the two models of the physical of the physical world in which we live do not look like they can support that. So the classical model of standard particle physics, we can say it's not random, but it's predictable. And at the quantum level, we can say it's not predictable, but it's random. And
but
so
you can't have both.
You can't have both.
Yeah.
And so what even physics is telling us now looks like there is no room for anywhere in there for some other element to sort of influence these physical systems in a way that free will looks like it would need.
So physics doesn't support the idea that there's complete autonomy.
That's right.
Right.
Now, we can talk about autonomy in a deterministic way, in the sense that, well, if I am the product of my genes and environment, my phenotype, and my phenotype has certain desires that I didn't choose, but they're kind of there, then we can make a distinction between me choosing A over B, me choosing granola over ice cream because I'm worried about my figure, or we can talk about involuntary actions, heteronomous actions, where someone else has me at gunpoint and making me do something.
Right.
So in a way, I think in a free will discussion, we can potentially save rational deliberation. That may be different than, say, contra-causal free will.
Now, you use the word determinism.
Yes.
So usually when we talk about free will, we frame it as if free will is the opposite of determinism.
Right.
And as if it's either or, either we're freely autonomous or we're completely determined by outside and external forces.
Right.
Is that a false dichotomy?
I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe so. So free will is supposed to be that part of us that somehow is over and above, beyond all of the physical systems that we know constitutes the human body. And so in philosophical terms, a common stance to support free will would be something that we call dualism, where the idea is that I have a mind and a body, and in theological language, a spirit and flesh, and that these two somehow interact, and that's always caused Cartesians, those people who follow Descartes on this one, that's caused some issues. But cognitive psychology actually shows us that the majority of human animals tend to default to some form of dualism, that it just feels right. There's an intuitive kind of appeal to the idea that my mind is somehow divorceable or divorced from my body and can, in effect, control what my body does, but nothing controls my mind. That's where my true autonomy resides.
So the free will choice comes from the mind, from the consciousness.
From the consciousness. That's how many people will play it out, that I can consciously deliberate it. And we can all do this. We can all introspect and really think that we're deliberating our choices. Should I have the granola bar, or should I have another scoop of ice cream? You know?
So if you were to take the position of determinism, then you would have to locate some kind of force that would act upon the consciousness or
That's
act
right.
upon the mind.
That's right. And so what seems to be the case is that, and again, neuroscience is pretty robust in its conclusions on this score, that a good bit of our mind, our brain, the activity takes place beneath the threshold of consciousness. Okay. So that's one of the reasons why taking introspection so seriously might be problematic. Most of the hard work may already have been done prior to my conscious awareness of it. And there are some fascinating experiments that have been done. I think the first one was done back in 1985, Benjamin Libet, a very famous experiment, where he hooked people up to EEGs, which is a method back in the 80s of monitoring brain activity. And he asked the test subjects to decide if they're going to push the right button or the left button. And when they decide to do that, they asked them to look at a fine-grained timer to see when they were aware that they had finally made that conscious decision. The outcome of the experiment, however, showed that the experimenters could watch the brains of the subjects trying to decide when to press the button, and they knew ahead of the subject's conscious awareness of which button they were going to press, because the motor activity beneath the threshold of consciousness had already started to fire. So some other people might actually know us better than we know ourselves.
So is that a form of determinism then? The idea that our subconscious is somehow directing our activities, and even though consciously we think that we're doing this as a conscious free will choice.
That's right. That's right. So the first person phenomenological field, to use a fancy term, is that I'm freely aware and I'm making these choices, and I'm consciously aware, when in fact other parts of the brain look like they've already decided in advance. And we can argue, beneath the threshold of consciousness, we can still have rational deliberations going on. The subconscious parts of the brain could still be operating under certain rational algorithms to produce behavior that's adaptive and functional. But it just sort of says consciousness, just don't think yourself too high and mighty on this score.
So there's so much about the brain we don't understand.
Oh my gosh! We are at the tip of the iceberg. Doesn't even get us to where we are with neuroscience right now.
So we're talking about neuroscience, psychology. If we were to move the needle to theology then,
right,
and talk about determinism in a theological framework.
That's right.
How does the discussion change? How does the terminology change in that?
Well, I mean, there are multiple positions one can take theologically on the question of free will. I mean, we could go with John Calvin, for instance, and of course, the idea is that predetermination, right? That no matter what we would want to do, there's some sort of, we are fated to either be saved or, hope not, damned.
Yeah.
But most people I don't think are Calvinists like that. I think a lot of people like to think about free will being absolutely essential to many of the Abrahamic traditions. And by Abrahamic, of course, we mean Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Because one can argue that in these theological circles, original sin plays a big role in these theological worldviews. And I mean, if you're a Christian, you know that this is absolutely important to the role of Jesus Christ in the history of Christianity. And Jesus is supposed to pay for all of our sins, and these sins were freely committed. And so the idea is if we all inherit original sin, except maybe Mother Mary, with the Immaculate Conception, that if we go with the Genesis story, Eve had a choice. And Eve could have either eaten the apple or not eaten the apple. And God forbid, she ate the apple, and now we're all ostensibly suffering for it.
I always thought it was a little unfair to Eve that
yes,
she was responsible for making a moral choice before she gained the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
So it's a kind of circular myth there. But
oh yeah, I mean, much to the feminist theologian's chagrin.
But you're right. I mean, the whole idea of free will is tied in with this idea that free will leads us to, or is tied to morality in some way.
That's right. That's right. And many people get very uncomfortable when someone like yours truly would suggest we don't have free will, because it looks like it takes moral responsibility right out of the conversation.
Right.
And it would be naive to suggesting that we don't have free will doesn't have some sort of impact on how we view moral responsibility. Yeah. How do we handle people who do bad things, and what are we to do with them? And this gets us into big questions to do with criminal justice. How do we deal with bad actors?
Right.
And the scientific community, philosophical community that seems to be pretty convinced that there is no such thing as free will, asks us questions about how are we to respond to these people. If a bad actor does something especially egregious to one of our family members, it raises our anger, and we want to seek revenge and retribution. But the idea, and as hard as it may be to contemplate, we have to realize that no matter how bad the actor was, that bad actor did not choose the genes and environmental influences that led to that bad actor's bad actions. Yeah. And so we really have to start thinking about how do we handle the bad actor.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like a lot of our social structure, including, as you mentioned, the criminal justice system, is predicated on the notion that free will is connected to moral responsibility. If we choose wrongly, we violate moral codes.
That's right.
Those moral codes are connected to civil codes, so we have to be punished.
We have to be punished. That's right.
So what would the alternative look like if science wins the day?
Right.
And is able to create some sort of reform in society where free will and moral responsibility are somehow disconnected, or if the idea of free will disappears altogether.
Right.
What sort of implications does that have?
Absolutely. Right? There are some authors, scientists, philosophers who want to suggest that we just stop using the language of moral responsibility. That we can talk about organisms being responsible insofar as it was that organism that undertook that action, but to add the coefficient of morally responsible seems to sort of insist that this actor could have done otherwise. Okay. I think what we're dealing with now is that the criminal justice system and how we deal with bad actors is we want to embrace operant conditioning. And this is something that psychologists have been studying for decades now, that we know that we can alter an organism's future behavior by punishing or rewarding in the present. And so our criminal justice system and our prison systems, they wouldn't be there to seek revenge and retribution. They would be there to rehabilitate. In the instances where rehabilitation is not an option for whatever reasons, genetic, environmental, or both, that actor just cannot be let back out in society.
Yeah. Well, I know, maybe take perhaps the opposite direction of the argument here.
Sure.
One of the critiques against Calvinism that you mentioned earlier is that if there's no free will and no notion of moral responsibility, then that disincentivizes good behavior, right? So why would one be concerned about acting properly if they're not going to get credit for it, so to speak?
Right. Well,
maybe even Kant suggested something like that, without a notion
act
of
as if.
Yeah. If there's no free will, why would there be a notion of needing to act?
Well, on the one hand, of course, animals will just act. We behave.
Right.
And so. Back to operant conditioning, we can behave and be rewarded for it, and so I think that alone is some incentive to act in a better way than not, because I think we'd have to talk about someone being maybe a little bit pathological if they wanted to be punished more than they would like to be rewarded.
Right.
So I think on one hand, yes, we want to behave properly because we get praise for it and we get rewards for it. And ultimately, as we all can understand, society gets along much better if we cooperate and treat each other with some kind of empathy and compassion.
Right. So society, we could raise it to the societal level.
We certainly could. There are some people now who want to argue that, doubling down on our free will might be morally suspect. In fact, it might be morally to everyone's advantage to start looking at each other as physical systems that are obeying physical laws with the capacity to change behavior moving forward, which is what sort of differentiates a deterministic understanding from a fatalistic one. The fatalists will say the end will happen regardless of your rewards and punishments, and that just doesn't seem to be the case.
I wanted to ask you if there was a difference between determinism and fatalism, and I think you've just gone there.
Fatalism takes time and history completely out of the equation. It doesn't matter. It will end up any which way, and that doesn't seem persuasive.
Okay. So determinism, even though it may eliminate the notion of free will, still has room within the philosophical system for different outcomes.
That's right. And Owen Flanagan, a professor of philosophy at Duke University, likes to talk not about responsibility, but responsibility. So we have an ability to respond to reactions to our actions and adjust our behaviors moving forward. Mm-hmm. And that seems to work just nicely.
Yeah. Let me switch direction just a little bit. You're a scholar, among other things, of the Hindu tradition.
Yes, I am.
And there's, of course, this famous doctrine of karma.
That's right.
Is the doctrine of karma, maybe you should explain that first, but is this enlightening in any way to this discussion?
Well, I think, karma, first and foremost, it generally means actions and the fruits of your actions. And in the South Asian traditions in general, the idea is that when we behave, we create ripples into the future and that these ripples will come back to us. And so that if we are good, good things will return. And if we're bad, bad things will return. In effect, the karma doctrine at some point, I think, envisions that there was a moment where we had a choice between certain things and we chose one or the other, and that these choices do in fact affect our karmic load moving forward. So in a way, what I think we see a lot of the world religions doing, either through an original sin and grace and judgment or through karma, this more sort of points in the direction that the human animal seems very much interested in what we would call the just world hypothesis. We have, and this could be endowed to us by natural selection, but we want to make sure that people enjoy what they deserve and suffer what they deserve. We really push back against injustice. Things need to have reasons, and especially in the social sphere, that usually somehow involves some notion that we have free will and that we either chose poorly or chose correctly.
Yeah. And the doctrine of karma then supports that just world.
That's right.
Notion.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the Marxists, kind of have a heyday with it, but it's kind of in the Hindu system, if we're talking about caste Hinduism, if you're in a lower caste, say a Shudra caste, then you're there because of what you did in a past life.
Right.
And I mean, it lends an ideological justification, but yeah, it's there.
So any of these systems, whether they're free will based, deterministically based, karmic based, they can all be justifications for the status quo, or they could be used as justifications for change.
I think so. Yeah. And I think most of the people who are arguing for determinism now, they think it's going to be a change for the better, that it will nurture, once again, it will nurture compassion and empathy. They couldn't help it. No matter how egregious it was, for whatever reason, their particular sets of genes and their environmental spaces of development, that combination, it led them to that particular fork in the road, and they chose that particular path.
So just hearing you talk, it sounds to me like that the notion that people who believe strongly in free will are apt to be better people. That
doesn't seem to be the case. Now, there are some studies that suggest that if you prime people with the notion they don't have free will, they have behaved poorly. Yeah. But other studies point in the other direction. So at least the psychological literature, that jury is still out. We can't say definitively whether or not believing in it or not believing in it, that is free will, what the outcome en masse would ultimately be.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, so sometimes in these discussions, the question of theodicy comes up.
Oh, yes.
The so-called problem of evil.
Problem of evil.
Is evil a real thing? Does it exist? And
yes.
If so, why does it seem to affect us unjustly sometimes? You mentioned the,
yes.
the concept of justice. How does that play into this discussion?
So theodicy is only, the problem of evil looks like it's only a problem for those theological groups that maintain that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, all-good, right? And so the question is, why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there so much suffering? And the most robust defense has tended to be the free will defense, that God gave us a free will because He wanted, ultimately, as many theologians will say, because He wanted us to choose freely a relationship with Him, or if you're in the Hindu goddess tradition, her. But the idea is that that gift of free will, even though we used it poorly and now suffer for it, it's still a greater good. It still outweighs all the suffering. Right. The problem with that, though, is that does having free will necessitate making a bad choice? If having free will necessitates making a bad choice, and God is omniscient, and God gave us something He knew we would use poorly, so He knew we would suffer for it. So that doesn't really exculpate God from the problem. Right. On the other hand, if having free will, ostensibly God might have free will, and never make a bad choice, ostensibly God doesn't make bad choices, then why couldn't we have that one? Why couldn't we have a free will such that every time we came along, A and B, and A is always good and B is always, go figure, bad, we always chose A. We could recognize the bad choice, but always chose A. Yeah. So free will defense in theodicy and the problem of evil, it has some problems. It doesn't go through as quickly as some people would like it to do.
But for the most part, at least in the Christian tradition, if you free will is almost a safety valve for the divine, right? It takes some of the responsibility of bad things off of God. So if we begin to question the notion of free will, then the question of evil becomes a more prominent one.
It certainly does. Yeah. It certainly does. Because again, it's going to come down to this question of, do we deserve it? Yeah. Right? And how could anyone, one could make an argument, how could anyone in a finite lifespan, for instance, if we're talking about Judgment Day, how could any human animal between age 1 and 80 make such a bad choice as to warrant eternal punishment? That seems peculiar to a lot of people. But we could potentially suggest that the Abrahamic religions, maybe in ways that the non-Abrahamic religions don't, but the Abrahamic religions really look like they stand or fall on this issue. It's a very weighty issue for the Abrahamic traditions.
So it's threatening.
It can be very
threatening. I guess science is threatening the Abrahamic theologies.
It looks that way.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? Do you think that science is going to make some real discoveries in the next decade or two
Yes.
that will get okay that will shine light, and so that we'll better understand what's going on in our minds when we
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. What neuroscience is doing, you can't make this up. This is sometimes like quantum mechanics. It seems stranger than fiction. Yes, we put your seatbelts on, everyone. We're on for a ride.
Well, I for one am excited to see where some of these studies take us.
Me too.
I hope that religious leaders and people of faith can move beyond the notion that this is somehow threatening, but rather enlightening. But anyway, it's an exciting field, and I appreciate you sharing your expertise.
What little I have
to help
happy
us
to share.
to help us better understand why we worry about these things and
Yes.
how we can better understand them. But thanks for coming again.
Oh, again,
You're always
my
welcome.
pleasure.
Always welcome here.
It's always a joy.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life this week. Join us next week when my guest will be Jeff McLean, Director of Congregational Care at Boone United Methodist Church, who will talk about the challenges and rewards of leading religious communities. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.